In post-war Britain, the dullest decade in living memory was about to crack open. It was the early 1960s. Rationing had only just ended. National service was finally over. And a generation of working-class teenagers in London found themselves with money in their pockets, time on their hands, and absolutely nothing to spend either one on until the records arrived. Not British records, not pop records, American soul records, records that black servicemen stationed in Britain had smuggled over from the States and sold to young people in Soho back streets. Records that had been deleted, buried, or ignored entirely in America, but sounded to these sharp-dressed London teenagers like the future itself. They called themselves mods, and the American soul records they discovered in those years didn't just soundtrack their lives. They built an entire subculture that still echoes through British culture today. These are 10 of those records and the stories behind why they mattered. Number 10, James Brown, Night Train, 1962. James Brown recorded Night Train in 1961, and it hit the American charts in 1962, reaching number 5 on the R&B chart and number 35 on the pop chart. But the version that British mods worshipped was not the studio single. It was the live version captured at the Apollo Theater in Harlem in October 1962. The concert that James Brown funded himself with $5,700 of his own money after his record label boss, Sid Nathan, flatly refused to pay for a live album. Nathan thought it was a waste of money. Brown believed otherwise. He was right.
Are you ready for the night train?
Live at the Apollo spent 66 weeks on the Billboard Pop Album chart and peaked at number 2. It changed everything.
Let me hear you say yeah! I said let me...
Night Train closes the album, a roaring, sweating, impossibly alive performance that sounds like a locomotive built from pure human energy. The original song was a jazz standard from 1951 by Jimmy Forrest. Brown stripped out the original lyrics and replaced them with a list of cities on his own touring itinerary: Miami, Atlanta, Raleigh, Washington, D.C., shaping it into a personal geography of Black America.
Ready for the night train!
In London, DJ Guy Stevens was the first to play it at the Scene Club in the Ham Yard, Soho, the most important mod club in the city. Stevens had an extraordinary nose for American records that British youth had never heard.
Night! Night!
When Night Train dropped on that dance floor, the mods went wild. The beat was unlike anything on British radio. The urgency was unlike anything in British music.
What?
Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames, who held a long residency at the nearby Flamingo Club, added it to their set list immediately, with Fame shouting out London Tube station names in place of Brown's American cities, making it something uniquely British and uniquely theirs.
Night!
Number 9, Marvin Gaye, Can I Get a Witness, 1963. Marvin Gaye walked into Hitsville, USA on July 17, 1963, and recorded Can I Get a Witness in a single take. A single take. Lyricist Eddie Holland, who had sung the song for Gaye once, showing him the melody, was stunned. He later recalled that most artists needed multiple run-throughs before they felt comfortable with a new song. Gaye just nodded, said, "Okay, I'm ready," and recorded a masterpiece in one pass. The song was written by Holland Dozier Holland, Motown's greatest songwriting trio, built entirely on the call and response structure of a black church sermon. The congregation shouts back to the preacher demands witnesses. The groove underneath is relentless, jubilant, and completely irresistible. In America, the song peaked at number 22 on the Hot 100. It spent 16 weeks on the chart, longer than any other Gaye entry on the Hot 100 in the 1960s. And in London, it caused an immediate sensation. Wikipedia's own entry on the song notes that it made a buzz in the United Kingdom, primarily among dance clubs in London and Northern England, particularly Leeds. The Rolling Stones covered it on their very first album in 1964. Dusty Springfield covered it the same year. Elton John played it to close his entire set at Live Aid in 1985 in front of the largest television audience in history. Rolling Stone ranked it 68th among the 100 greatest Motown songs of all time, calling it arguably Gaye's first classic hit. At the Scene Club in the Flamingo, it was the kind of record that made mods stop posing and just dance. Listen, 90% of you watching these videos right now ain't subscribed yet. If these stories are blowing your mind, imagine what you're missing. Hit subscribe, turn on that bell, and join the R&B fans who never miss a Groove Lens upload. Number 8, Martha and the Vandellas, Dancing in the Street, 1964. The most important fact about Dancing in the Street is that the engineer almost didn't record it. Martha Reeves told the story many times. She had just finished the take. There were congratulations all around, hand slaps, people saying, "We got a hit in that window up there." And then engineer Lawrence Horn looked up and said calmly, "I didn't turn the machine on." They had to do it again. Fortunately, the second recording was every bit as good as the first. Marvin Gaye had originally recorded the song and sang it like a smooth serenade. Reeves had been to Rio de Janeiro and New Orleans during Mardi Gras, and she could not hear the song that way at all. She asked the producers if she could sing it the way she felt it, as a block party, a street carnival, a communal eruption. They said, "Go ahead." The song was captured in 2 takes, written by Gaye, Mickey Stevenson, and Ivy Jo Hunter. It reached number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 in October 1964, kept from the top only by Manfred Mann's Doo-Wah Diddy Diddy, a British band covering an American song. In Britain itself, the original 1964 release barely crept to number 28, but every self-respecting mod in London knew it. You Discover Music documented exactly that. Every self-respecting British mod loved it, but not everyone else in the UK agreed. When Motown reissued it in 1969, it climbed to number 4 in the UK. A David Bowie and Mick Jagger duet cover took it to UK number 1 in 1985. It was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 1999 and the National Recording Registry in 2006. The song that was nearly lost to an engineer who forgot to press record became one of the great anthems of the 20th century. Number 7, Wilson Pickett. In the Midnight Hour, 1965. The beat in the Midnight Hour was invented in a hotel room and demonstrated by a middle-aged record executive doing a dance. Atlantic Records president Jerry Wexler flew to Memphis with Wilson Pickett in May 1965, determined to record something special with the Stax House Band. The night before the session, Pickett and guitarist Steve Cropper checked into a hotel and wrote several songs together in just 2 hours. Cropper took a phrase he had heard Pickett sing on an old gospel record, "I'll see my Jesus in the midnight hour," and turned it into "I'll see my baby in the midnight hour." In the studio the next morning, something else happened. Wexler stood up in front of Cropper and drummer Al Jackson and demonstrated a dance called the jerk, shifting his weight to emphasize the second beat instead of the first. Cropper later said, "This was the way the kids were dancing. They were putting the accent on too." That delayed backbeat became the signature sound of Stax Records for the next several years. Every record they made after that session carried its DNA. In the Midnight Hour hit number 1 on the R&B chart in August 1965 and crossed to number 21 on the pop chart, selling over 1 million copies and winning Pickett his first Grammy nomination. In Britain, it went to number 12. At mod clubs across London and the north of England, the delayed backbeat hit the dancers like a physical force. The song is on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Songs of All Time. It is in the Grammy Hall of Fame. And it was born because a record label boss stood up in a Memphis studio and started dancing. Number 6, Otis Redding, Fa, 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 Sad Song, 1966. By 1966, Otis Redding had released 4 studio albums in under 3 years and was known throughout the soul world as Mr. Pitiful, the king of slow, devastating ballads. So he decided to make fun of himself. Sweet melody tonight. Fa, 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 Sad Song is a song that is nominally about sadness. But the way he sings it is the musical equivalent of a man laughing at his own reputation. The lyrics is almost beside the point. The entire song is built around a conversation between Redding's voice and his horn section, the Memphis Horns. He told them when to play by singing their parts, fa, 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 your turn, and built a full song around that spontaneous studio shorthand. He told interviewers the horn riff was inspired by the theme to a 1950s TV quiz show called the $64,000 Question. I can sing, and when I get to sing. The song peaked at number 29 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 12 on the R&B chart. In the UK, it was a modest hit at the time. It's a lovely song, y'all. But at mod clubs, it was something much more. Because British mods didn't just dance to American soul music, they studied it, they broke it apart and asked what made it work. I've been singing them sad songs. And Fa, 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 Fa was a song that showed them everything. The call and response, the horn arrangement, the wit behind the emotion, the rawness of a voice that could move between comedy and devastation in a single phrase. Redding performed at the Stax Volt European Tour in March and April 1967, playing to rapturous British audiences who had been learning his music for years. He died in a plane crash in December 1967 at 26 years old. And every musician who ever heard Fa, 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 Fa still hears, beneath the syllables, the shape of what soul music actually is. Number 5, Junior Walker and the All-Stars. Shotgun, 1965. Junior Walker never intended to be a frontman. Born Autry DeWalt Mixon Jr. in Blytheville, Arkansas in 1931. He was a saxophone player, a raw, ferocious tenor saxophonist who had grown up playing in honky-tonks and roadhouses and thought of himself as an instrumentalist, not a singer. When Harvey Fuqua, co-founder of Harvey Records and later a key Motown figure, first saw Walker perform, he called Berry Gordy. Gordy signed the band immediately. But when it came to recording, there was a problem. The designated vocalist didn't show up for the shotgun session. Walker, standing there with his saxophone, was pushed in front of the microphone. He was reluctant and uncomfortable. He sang the way he played saxophone, raw, guttural, with no polish whatsoever. Producer Lawrence Horn built the track around Walker's saxophone and his untrained bark of a voice. The result was like nothing Motown had released before. Where the label's other records were smooth, layered, and polished, Shotgun was dirty, stomping, and wild. It hit number 1 on the R&B chart in February 1965 and crossed to number 4 on the Billboard Hot 100. In Britain, it reached number 1 on the pirate radio charts before it even had an official UK release. At the Flamingo and the Scene, mods went absolutely mad for it. The saxophone was the mod instrument, cool, improvisational, rooted in jazz, and Walker played it like a man possessed. British bands immediately began copying the sound. The song appeared in the 2014 Marvel film Guardians of the Galaxy and introduced it to an entirely new generation. But the mods had known it for nearly 50 years before that. Number 4, Solomon Burke. Everybody Needs Somebody to Love, 1964. Solomon Burke was 6'2", weighed well over 300 pounds, wore a crown on stage, and was carried to his microphone in a jeweled throne. He was one of the great characters in the history of American music. A minister, an entrepreneur, an undertaker, a farmer, a restaurateur, and for a brief and extraordinary period in the early 1960s, quite possibly the greatest soul singer alive.
The devil needed and never wanted someone to love.
Everybody Needs Somebody to Love was released on Atlantic Records in 1964. The song was written by Burke himself, along with Jerry Wexler and Burt Burns.
And you lose what you had. There's a song I sing.
It reached number 58 on the Hot 100, A disappointing commercial result for a record of such extraordinary power. But at the Scene Club in London, where DJ Guy Stevens held court, it was the opening salvo of every big night. The call and response chorus, Brooke demanding the audience shout back, was tailor-made for a club full of speed-fueled mods who desperately wanted to be part of something. Yeah. The Rolling Stones covered it on their second album in 1965, extending the arrangement to nearly 5 minutes with an increasingly frenzied audience response. The Stones would open their concerts with it for years.
My name and my number. Listen.
In the 1980 film The Blues Brothers, John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd performed a version in which Jake Blues delivers a sermon monologue before the song begins, directly modeling Burke's original church preacher performance style.
And let everything in your life go wrong.
The film version introduced the song to an entirely new audience, but the mods at the Scene Club in 1964 already knew. They had known since the first time Guy Stevens dropped the needle.
If you need me, darling.
Number 3, Don Covay, Mercy, Mercy, 1964. Don Covay is one of the most important musicians in American popular music, and almost nobody knows his name. Born Donald Randolph in Orangeburg, South Carolina in 1938, he grew up singing in his family's gospel group, called the Cherry Keys, in Washington, D.C. He played guitar for Little Richard as a teenager. He was backed by a young band called the Upsetters on one of his early recordings, the same Upsetters who later became James Brown's famous Flames. And in 1964, he co-wrote a song with his guitarist Horace Ott called Mercy, Mercy, and recorded it for Rosemont Records. The production was bare bones and raw. A thin, rattling guitar line, a light drum beat, and Covay's voice, which sounded like a man pleading for his life. It reached number 35 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 24 on the R&B chart. The Rolling Stones heard it and immediately covered it for their second album in 1965. Mick Jagger said publicly that Don Covay was one of the most underrated singers in America. In mod circles, Covay was passed around like a secret. His records were hard to find in Britain, often available only as American imports discovered at specialist shops like Dobell's Jazz Record Shop on Charing Cross Road. That scarcity made him more valuable, not less. The mods were collectors. The harder a record was to find, the more it proved your dedication. Covay was later inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 2015. He died in 2015. The Stones inducted him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a non-performer in 2000. But the mods of Soho knew who he was half a century before the institution caught up. Number 2, Booker T and the MGs, Green Onions, 1962. Green Onions was recorded on July 9, 1962 at Stax Studios in Memphis, and it was recorded by accident. Booker T. Jones, the teenager who led the band, was accompanying blues singer Billy Lee Riley in a session that was going nowhere. During a break, The musicians started improvising around a 12-bar blues groove. Studio co-owner Chips Moman heard what was happening from the control room and quietly hit the record button. What emerged was 4 minutes and 9 seconds of perfect, self-contained soul jazz, built on Jones's Hammond B3 organ, Steve Cropper's guitar, Louis Steinberg's bass, and Al Jackson Jr.'s drums. It hit #1 on both the pop chart and the R&B chart in the autumn of 1962. In Britain, it was released the same year and became an immediate mod staple. But here's the thing about Green Onions and the Mods. It wasn't just a dance record, it was a statement of cool. It was the sound of restraint and precision, every note chosen, nothing wasted. Mods were obsessed with cool. They were obsessed with the idea that being effortlessly composed was the highest achievement possible. And Green Onions sounded exactly like that. It sounded like 4 men who had nothing to prove, who could say everything they needed to say without raising their voices. British mod culture scholar Tony Fletcher described the MGs as everything the Mods wanted to be: integrated, cool, musical, and completely free from sentiment. The song appeared in the 1997 Quentin Tarantino film, Jackie Brown. It has been used in dozens of films and commercials, but it started on a Soho dance floor in 1962, and it has never left. #1, The Impressions, It's All Right, 19